slapped a 13-year-old boy in front of the entire school and thought no one would question him. Sheriff Malden Knox, a decorated lawman known for his hard rules and harder tone, saw Julian Reyes, a quiet first-generation American boy, and assumed he could humiliate him without consequence. He mistook Julian's silence for submission. But when he picked Julian, he didn't know who he was messing with. He didn't know Julian had written a letter that had reached the highest office in the Department of Defense. He didn't know that letter had inspired a woman with the power to rewrite his entire moment of authority. Because what came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning in front of every parent, student, and teacher in that gym. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one boy. It's about all of us. Sunlight spilled across the gymnasium floor, glinting off polished shoes and silent eyes. Rows of students stood still in stiff collars and pressed shirts, not knowing that this would be a day their town would never forget. It was the kind of morning that made you sit up a little straighter. In the small town of Larkhaven, Georgia, the air was crisp, the sky washed in pale gold. At Larkhaven Middle Academy, rows of students gathered in the gymnasium. White shirts freshly pressed, maroon ties snug against their collars. The bleachers groaned under the weight of proud parents, most holding phones or small camcorders. It was Cadet Honor Day. A big deal in this little town. For many, it was the only ceremony that mattered more than graduation. Among them stood Julian Reyes, 13 years old. Quiet, steady, never the first to speak, but always the last to leave when a teacher needed help stacking chairs or wiping down a chalkboard. His shoes were polished, the result of his father's old army brush and a lot of care. He had dreams, not loud ones, but real. To serve his country, to heal others, to wear the uniform like his grandfather once did. Julian wasn't showy. He didn't push to the front. He simply did what was asked of him, and then a little more. That morning, he had been chosen to receive the Junior Cadet Certificate, a small but important recognition. One step closer to a future he could see, even if others couldn't. His mother, Elena, sat high in the bleachers, her eyes wide and proud, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd worked 2 shifts the night before, and still woke early to iron his shirt. Twice. There was something unspoken between them. This ceremony wasn't just for Julian. It was for every sacrifice that came before him. And yet, something in the air felt off. Too stiff, too quiet. The guest speaker was Sheriff Malden Knox, a local legend with a face made for TV and a voice like gravel. He was known for his speeches on discipline and real American grit. Parents applauded when he entered, but a few exchanged glances. Half respect, half unease. That's when the tension began to rise, slow but steady. Do you ever feel like something's about to go wrong and you can't explain why? Julian adjusted the pocket of his shirt. Just a small tug, nothing more. He didn't know that simple gesture would set off a chain of events that would change the room, and perhaps even his life. Sheriff Malden Knox took the stage like a man stepping into battle. His boots thudded across the polished floor, metals clinking softly against his chest. The microphone barely needed turning on. His voice boomed through the gym like a cannon. He spoke of duty, of honor, of old-fashioned values. Respect, he barked, is earned, but sometimes it has to be taught. Most students sat frozen, eyes wide, not quite sure how to react. Julian stood quietly in the second row, fingers twitching near his collar. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't distraction. It was just nerves. Just a boy adjusting the shirt his mother had ironed with aching arms the night before. And then, in a moment so swift it felt unreal, Sheriff Knox stepped off the stage. He walked straight toward Julian. No warning, no words. He raised his hand and struck the boy. Open palm, sharp, not violent enough to bruise, but loud enough to echo across the gym. The room gasped as one. Julian didn't fall. He didn't cry. He just stood there, stunned, red blooming across his cheek. The slap had less pain than it had weight, the kind of weight that tells a child he's suddenly very small in a very large room. Silence pressed down on the gym like a blanket. Then the sheriff said coldly, "You want to wear a uniform, son? Start by learning respect." It wasn't a correction. It was a lesson, a public one. What would you have done, watching from the crowd? Would you have stood up, or sat still, afraid to speak? From the bleachers, Elena rose to her feet, lips parted in shock. But a teacher placed a firm hand on her arm, shaking his head. And Julian? He was told to apologize. So he did, voice low, eyes down. "I didn't mean any disrespect." No protest, no explanation, just quiet. A moment later, a tear threatened, but didn't fall. Sometimes the worst wounds are the ones nobody sees. Unseen by most, at the far edge of the gym, a woman stood still. She wore a dark blue military uniform, the creases razor sharp, the ribbons on her chest barely catching the light. Her name was Captain Adrian Hall, and she hadn't said a word the entire ceremony. No one had introduced her. No one even noticed when she entered. But she had been there since the first speech, watching, especially watching Julian. After the slap, while the crowd tried to settle into uneasy silence, Captain Hall's gaze never left the boy. Not once. Something flickered in her eyes. Not shock, she'd seen worse, but disappointment maybe. Recognition even. Like she'd seen this scene before, somewhere long ago, with another child standing too small, under too much weight. Then, as Sheriff Knox returned to the stage and the principal fumbled with the microphone, the gym doors creaked open again, and everything stopped. A man's voice called out, loud and formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the United States Secretary of Defense, Rachel Allen." The sound dropped from the room like someone pulled the air out of it. Parents sat up straight. Students turned their heads in confusion. Julian stood frozen. And then came the footsteps. Measured, deliberate, echoing louder than the sheriff's voice had minutes earlier. She entered not like a storm, but like the eye of one. Secretary Allen, elegant in her gray suit, walked directly down the center aisle, her heels tapping against the gym floor like a drumbeat of authority. She passed the sheriff without a glance, past the principal, walked straight to Julian. Can you imagine what that moment must have felt like? For a boy who'd just been shamed, now standing in the shadow of the nation's highest military leader? She looked down at him and smiled. Not pity, but purpose. And then she turned to face the crowd. A stillness settled. A storm was coming, but it didn't roar. It whispered. Secretary Rachel Allen turned slowly toward the crowd. Her voice, when it came, was calm. Too calm. It carried the weight of command, but also something deeper, grief wrapped in purpose. "This young man," she said, resting a hand gently on Julian's shoulder, "wrote me a letter last month." The room went still again. Even the sheriff, standing stiffly off to the side, tilted his head slightly. "In his letter," she continued, "Julia wrote about his dream to serve. Not to command, not to control, but to heal. He said he wanted to become a military doctor, to help others the way someone once helped his grandfather." Murmurs rippled through the bleachers. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Secretary Allen looked back at Julian with something rare in a person who had seen war. Admiration. "That letter," she said, "touched my staff so deeply we framed it on the wall. It reminded us what true service looks like, not loud, not cruel, but kind, focused, honest." Then, slowly, she turned toward Sheriff Knox. "And today," she said, her voice tightening like a drawn bowstring, "I witnessed something else. A display of power without wisdom. Authority without empathy." The words hit harder than any slap. What do we become when we confuse fear with respect? She stepped back and nodded toward Captain Hall, who was now walking forward with a small box in her hand. Inside was a gleaming Department of Defense Mentorship Award. Alan took it and pressed it into Julian's palm. "We are starting a new scholarship in your name," she told him, eyes meeting his, "for students like you, future leaders who know that strength comes with compassion." Julian blinked. No words came, just a deep breath, like air finally returning to his lungs. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can give a child is to simply let them be seen. The pin gleamed in Julian's hand, small but heavy with meaning. His mother, Elena, finally stepped down from the bleachers, tears clinging to her lashes like morning dew. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She simply walked across the gym floor, through the silence, through the stairs, and wrapped her arms around her son. She leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "They saw you, mijo. They saw who you really are." Julian didn't speak. He didn't need to. His shoulders trembled, but he stood taller now. Not because someone had granted him power, but because someone had recognized his dignity. In the corner, Sheriff Knox turned away and walked out. No applause, no escort, just the sound of his footsteps growing smaller. The school announced, somewhat awkwardly, that all external disciplinary partnerships would be reviewed immediately. The principal fumbled through the rest of the program, but the crowd's attention was long gone. Their eyes were still on Julian. Funny how quickly people can see someone differently once they've been named by someone important. But wasn't Julian important before that moment? Isn't every quiet act of goodness worth noticing, even when no one's clapping? The ceremony ended, but the story didn't. Word of what happened spread beyond Larkhaven. News outlets called, military officials offered mentorships, but Julian didn't chase the spotlight. He still cleaned up after class, still helped carry library boxes. He hadn't changed. Not really. But the world's eyes had. And that might be the most powerful change of all. Because sometimes the real triumph isn't fame or applause. It's simply no longer being invisible. So the next time you see someone quietly doing good, ask yourself, will I be the one to truly see them? Sometimes the world doesn't see the quiet ones. The children who help without being asked. The people who don't speak loudly, but always show up. We've all known someone like that, or perhaps we've been that person ourselves. Julian's story reminds us that dignity doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need medals, uniforms, or applause. True dignity lives in how we treat others, even when no one's looking. And sometimes it takes just one person to recognize that quiet goodness to make it visible to the world. As we grow older, we know that life has a way of humbling the proud and lifting the kind. Power fades, but character remains. If we want to leave something behind, not just things, but meaning, it may be this: show respect before asking for it, and never underestimate the strength of a gentle soul. So today, maybe we can look a little closer at a neighbor, a grandchild, a stranger in the grocery line. Ask yourself, who around me might be quietly waiting to be seen? It didn't end with applause. There was no music, no celebration. Just a boy standing a little taller, and a mother holding him a little tighter. That's what quiet power looks like. It doesn't shout or seek the spotlight. It survives. It forgives. It holds its ground when others turn away. In the days that followed, the school began to review its policies. Leaders made calls. Students whispered less and listened more. Something had shifted, not just in Julian's life, but in the way the town looked at dignity, at silence, at justice. Because what happened wasn't just about a slap. It was about being seen, about remembering that racism, when left unchallenged, doesn't just silence voices. It teaches others to stop listening. But not this time. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.